Guys, here's another tutorial for GCSE RS AQA Syllabus A, and we're starting a new theme today. This is Paper 2, Social Justice. What is social justice? Okay, so the first thing to talk about is the meaning of social justice. So social justice is this idea of creating a fairer world. And the world we live in is incredibly unfair. It's been estimated that, for example, 85 people own half the wealth of the entire population of the world. It's an incredibly unfair world, and some economists have said that the 21st century will be the most unequal century in human existence. So the gap between the rich and poor is getting bigger all the time. This may be driven by globalization and other things. And there's a real imperative in the Bible to create a fairer world. I mean, God created man in his image, Genesis 1, which of course is in the Old Testament and it's also in the Torah. So this is equally applicable to Jews and Christians. And it doesn't say that God created some men better than others, or it doesn't say that he created some races better than others. It just says God created man in his image, and all men share qualities of God, the ability to love unconditionally, like agape or chesed from a Jewish perspective. And so all human beings have equal validity or importance to God. So social justice is about creating a fairer world. And this is driven by human rights. Now, human rights are rights that all humans should have by the virtue of being a human being. And they were kind of set in stone, and kind of, they've always, people have always talked about them since the start of time, but they were really set in stone in 1948 when the United Nations came up with this Charter of Human Rights. And these are 30 rights that all people should have. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 1 of that, the first article, is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So Article 1 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights suggests that we're all equal. Now, this declaration was enshrined into British law in 1998 by the then Labour government under Tony Blair, which means this country is signed up to the United Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the trouble with rights is they do come with responsibilities. Where does one person's right infringe on another person's right? And an example of this from a religious perspective has been certainly during the Iraq War and the Afghan War that Britain sent soldiers to fight alongside the Americans. There were many British Muslims who would protest at the returning dead soldiers before their burials, and they would protest at those funerals and protest in quite extreme ways, holding placards suggesting that British soldiers had killed innocent Muslims and should burn in hell, and so on and so forth. And another example, in Paris in 2015, a French magazine called Charlie Hebdo published a front cover of its magazine with a picture of Muhammad on. Not a particularly flattering picture of Muhammad, a kind of jokey picture. And of course Muslims are, this is totally against Muslim law, Sharia law. You cannot depict the Prophet or Allah. And this enraged Muslims around the world. But it actually led also to a terrorist attack where some terrorists broke into Charlie Hebdo magazine's office and opened fire with automatic weapons and killed 11 people. Now, you could say, obviously, that is legally and morally wrong. That is totally wrong. No one would agree with that. However, if Charlie Hebdo hadn't published that picture, sort of stretching its right to freedom of speech, and maybe that attack wouldn't happen. So I'm not saying it's right. What I'm saying is that the right to freedom of speech can sometimes lead to offending others. We can say things that might offend people. So with rights comes responsibilities, and we must practice our right, for example, the right to freedom of speech, very carefully. Now, what does the Bible say about this? So the Bible teaches that God is a God of justice. One of the qualities of God is that he's just and he's fair. And in the Old Testament, many prophets talked about how the rich would be punished or seen bad in the eyes of God if they didn't do their bit for the poor. And one of them, Amos, said, "You trample the poor, stealing their grain through taxes and unfair rent. Therefore, though you build beautiful stone houses, you will never live in them." And what Amos is saying is that if you don't care for the needs of the poor whilst on earth, you will never live in the afterlife. The stone houses that you build will only exist for the time that you're on this planet, but God will punish you when you die, so you will never live in those beautiful stone houses. I mean, you will live in them, but you won't live in them forever. And so there's this imperative to help the poor. Now, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus, of course, says many things about helping the poor. But one thing I'd like to focus on here is the two great commandments. When one of the Jewish members of Jesus' audience was asking Jesus, what is the most important commandment, which is the most important of the mitzvot? Remember, Jews have 613. Jesus said, love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. So we can summarize that to love God, love your neighbour. Now, clearly, loving your neighbour means help your neighbour in any situation where help is needed. And somebody asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbour? And Jesus then told the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, you're probably all familiar with the Good Samaritan. A Jewish man is mugged, left for dead. He's ignored by a rabbi and a Jewish businessman. And it's a Samaritan that stops to help him. And, of course, Jews and Samaritans were avowed enemies. And so the point of the Good Samaritan story is that everyone's your neighbour, even your enemy. Now, another quote in the Bible which can be really used to talk about social justice is James. James says, faith without deeds is useless. So believing in God without doing things that will please God, i.e. helping the poor, is a waste of time. Now, how have Christians put this into practice? Now, throughout history, Christians have taken this idea that faith without deeds is useless, and they've run with it. So, some examples I can give you are William Wilberforce. Now, William Wilberforce was a man, a politician, who fought to abolish slavery in the British Empire, and he devoted his whole life to the abolishment of slavery, which he saw as wronging humanity and wronging God. Another example is Elizabeth Fry. She was a Quaker, used to appear on the back of the £5 note. She was displaced by Winston Churchill, I think. And she was a Quaker who went into prisons and saw the terrible conditions in prisons. Men and women were kept together. There were no flushing toilets. People would basically live in very unsanitary conditions. No food was provided. If relatives didn't bring you food and water, you often starved to death. Many people died in prison before they even went to court. And Elizabeth Fry reformed prisons, and the prison system that we have today, that we kind of take for granted today, is largely due to the work of Elizabeth Fry and her pressurising governments to change and to create modern prisons as we know them today. So there are many examples of Victorian philanthropists, they will be called, who put their Christianity into practice by helping the poor and improving the conditions of the less well-off in line with these ideas of social justice we've talked about. So it's very important that when you're writing your answers, you have some case study examples. Talk about William Wilberforce, talk about Elizabeth Fry. Faith without deeds is useless. Give examples of how people have employed that. And you can give examples that generally Christians might do. For example, donating to food banks, volunteering to help in a charity shop, and so on and so forth. So social justice is this idea of creating a fairer world, closing the gap between the rich and the poor, spreading God's creation, or the fruits of God's creation to us all, and making the world a better place. And we do that by focusing on improving human rights, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of movement, the right to vote in fair elections, and so on and so forth. And those rights are enshrined in British law and European law, actually, as you're probably well aware. So I hope that introduces the concept of social justice, and I'll see you soon for another tutorial. Take care.